Thank you for coming to today's workshop. You can see the title here. In order to explain about what we mean by qi regulation therapy, and in order to understand why the Japanese practitioners tend to do it the way they do it, I'm going to start by looking at the early history of qi and the associations that were described between qi and the mind and emotions. And now I'm really nervous because there's a few scholars in the room that read Chinese, and oh God. And that kind of thing makes me a little bit neurotic because my Chinese is a bit primitive. But anyway, so I'm going to start with a lecture, kind of a theoretical, historical lecture to set the background, and then we're going to look at the practice style, and I'll demonstrate some techniques, and then as soon as we can, we'll go into practicing and learning the basics of those techniques. Okay, so I'm a practitioner I've only really ever practiced Japanese acupuncture. I first learned a kind of pre-TCM style from Tin Yao So, who studied in the 1930s. Then I learned TCM with Ted Kapchuk. And then in the second year of school, we started needling each other. And I discovered every time I was needled, I fainted. And after a few months of fainting and driving my colleagues in class crazy because they hated needling me and I hated being needled, I started feeling really neurotic. How am I ever going to do acupuncture? I don't like the feeling of it. It doesn't feel right. And then this funny Japanese person turned up at the school demonstrating Japanese acupuncture techniques, and when she needled me, I didn't faint. So I decided to do Japanese stuff. And so I've kind of dedicated myself to practicing and studying Japanese acupuncture ever since. And I tell that story because I also want you to understand the needling techniques are really very different, as you will see today. Okay? They're much lighter, they're much easier to deal with. Even neurotic people like me don't mind the needling techniques. So it could be that that's really useful for people who have psychological, emotional difficulties. Okay? So as well as practicing Japanese acupuncture for a little more than 3 decades now, and going to Japan regularly to study, I've also authored a number of books which describe some of the background of the things that we're doing here. But the specific techniques on meridian therapy, I didn't write any books on that, so I'll tell you which books to look at. For example, Denmei Shudo's book. Stephen Brown was lecturing last year, for example. So that's what we're going to do. I try to do as much practice as possible, which is why you're only a small group. I'm saying that because I'm hoping you're only a small group because it's not that more than 20 people wanted to come. No, it's not that more than 20 people didn't want to come. Anyway, we're going to practice in 4 tables here. I should also say, being English, that's my native language. I think for everybody in the room, English is a second or a third language, and I talk fast sometimes. So if you feel I didn't understand it, stick your hand up and stop me and make me say it again. If it's not clear, ask questions. I encourage questions rather than not. Because it's terrible as somebody standing here watching your face go, and I can see you're just losing it completely. I'd rather not see those faces. Ask me the questions so that then I don't feel nervous about what's going on in here. Okay? So in order to this idea about treatment of psychological emotional problems and this concept of qi regulation, I think it's important to look at the role, the understanding of how did the concept of qi evolve, and why are we making this association between qi and the mind and the emotions, the way I'm going to describe them, and this idea of regulating qi. What kind of things does that imply? And I'm not going to say this is what they were doing in China 2,000 years ago. I'm going to give you some quotes and some ideas from historical sources and then describe why Japanese practitioners feel it's reasonable to do what they do on the basis of that. Okay, it's not about being right or wrong, but reasonable interpretations. So there have been some quite clear statements in the early literature about these associations. And I should also mention, I'm assuming most of you have probably some TCM background. And because I studied TCM, although I never used it, I also am familiar with how my colleagues who practice TCM diagnose people who come in really nervous or very emotional, and the language they use for that. And it's a different language than what we're going to present here, or somewhat different. So when that becomes apparent, feel free to ask the questions. Okay? So anyway, the early literature about qi and the mind, it's quite clear that there's a relationship between these two. I'm going to sit so I don't get a crick in the neck. Okay? The concept of qi evolved in relation to a process in society and for individuals of trying to create more order in the world and in themselves. Okay? Trying to order